The Morello crime family continued to prosper through means both fair and foul. The company formed by Morello and Lupo, known as the Ignots Florio Cooperative, was immediately successful. Originally formed on December 31, 1902, the cooperative was named after the most prominent Sicilian businessman of the day, Ignots Florio. Florio, a shipping magnate from Palermo, was one of the wealthiest men in Italy, and his family was known for doing business with the mafia. The company's president was Antonio Milone. Milone was Corleonese and a close ally of Morello's in Little Italy. Morello himself was listed as the treasurer, and 4 other directors, all prominent figures in the Sicilian community, rounded out the board. Lupo was kept off any paperwork at his own insistence. Shares in the company were offered at $2 and $5. There was no need to coerce anybody into buying stock. The community's grudging respect for Lupo and Morello's business sense was sufficient to convince several hundred small investors. Most of the co-op's properties were built in the outer reaches of the city, where land could still be purchased cheaply. The plan was to erect 2 rows of Italian tenements on 137th Street and 138th Street, as well as Cypress Avenue in the Bronx. These properties were completed by 1906. There were several other projects also. The co-op purchased lots on 80th Street, 109th Street, and Beach Avenue. The largest of its developments was a row of tenements built on 140th Street. The buildings constructed by the association were sold as soon as they were finished. Neither Morello nor Lupo had any interest in becoming a landlord. This early move into construction by the mafia foreshadowed what was to become one of their most lucrative rackets. From 1905 through 1906, Lupo and Morello took out mortgages totaling $336,000 to fund more than a dozen different construction projects. New York City was booming, and the Morello family was profiting because of it. With more immigrants settling in the city every day, Morello began thinking about growing the borgata and had plans for expanding its reach. The Mafia of 1906 was a loosely organized collection of families in 8 or 10 cities that rarely communicated, let alone cooperated. Morello wanted to change that. He had been in correspondence with several mafiosos from all over the country and had plans someday for a nationwide cosca. Meanwhile, back home, several new men had come into the fold, adding both territory and manpower to the already fearsome borgata. It was with this in mind that he called a meeting between his capos. As they sat, Morello poured each man a drink. After that was done, the boss began to speak. "We have many trustworthy men who toil with us in the streets every day. Also, leaders from other crews and territories have been incorporated into our borgata. Is it not time that the best of those take the oath?" Morello's half-brother Niccolo jumped in. "There is more opportunity now than ever, but also more risk. I think it would be prudent to spread both around," he said with a flourish. Lupo bluntly agreed. "Of course, I need more men. Cannot do the work myself." With no dissent among the other capos, it was decided to initiate new members. Morello and Lupo had several men from within their own crews with whom they wanted to elevate. However, the most important men made that day were leaders from other small gangs who had fallen by choice or by force underneath Morello's thumb. The brothers Fortunato and Tommaso Lamonte were 2 such men. Morello met the brothers years earlier when he employed one of their cousins in his grocery business. The brothers had just organized the Plasterers' Union and were both good earners and loyal men. Also being made was a close associate of the Lamontes by the name of Giuseppe Massaria. A Sicilian immigrant from western Sicily, Massaria arrived in Manhattan in 1900. He began his criminal career as a professional burglar, where he came to the attention of Ignazio Lupo. Massaria led a small group of thugs who specialized in burglary. In 1907, at 21 years old, Massaria received a suspended sentence after breaking into an apartment on Elizabeth Street. He earned Lupo's trust when he threatened his own family on the Wolf's orders due to an unpaid debt. He had proven his worth with a gun as well. Other leaders of smaller gangs such as Sal Aquila in Brooklyn and Gaetano Reina in the Bronx would also pledge allegiance to the Morellos. Weeks later, with everything arranged, Morello, his brothers, Lupo, and others from the borgata assembled in the basement of a tenement building owned by the family. Among the men being made today would be several future leaders in the mob. They had not told the inductees the purpose of this meeting, and so many of them squirmed and fidgeted as they waited for whatever came next. Giuseppe Masseria tried to remain calm, as one by one, each of the other men were called down into the basement. Alone, he thought of his childhood and the road that led him to this place and time. Finally, Vincent Terranova came up the stairs and motioned for him to follow. Masseria descended and entered the basement. He was shown to an empty chair where he sat. Then the boss began to speak. "Give me your hand," Morello said quietly. Joe Masseria did as he was bid. His finger was pricked and blood was smeared on the card of a saint. "May your soul burn like this saint if you ever betray this brotherhood," Morello finished as the burning card was placed in Masseria's hands. After the card turned to ash, the ceremony ended and drinks and cigars were passed around. The Depression of 1907 destroyed the American economy more completely than any financial panic since the slump of 1893. The Ignots Florio cooperative was not immune from its effects. This crisis spread rapidly thanks largely to poor planning by many large corporations. By late summer, share prices were falling across the board. As stocks tumbled, financial houses all along Wall Street found themselves with insufficient assets to cover their exposure, and one by one, they failed. So severe was the financial shock generated by this disaster that its effects whipsawed around the globe. Thanks in part to the guidance of financier J.P. Morgan, the worst of this panic had run its course by October of 1907. However, even Morgan could not stop this crisis from creating financial ruin in New York City. Immigrant communities were among the hardest hit, and construction in the city slowed to a crawl. Next came a run on the banks. 25 failed in Little Italy alone. Their collapse cost thousands of customers their savings. Hundreds of small businesses then went bankrupt. Only those that were well established, well run, and well managed would survive the onslaught. The Ignots Florio cooperative was not prepared, and as such, it felt the full force of the recession. The price of land and property both plummeted, exposing Lupo and Morello to large losses on several projects. By the summer of 1908, the association had exhausted its remaining funds and began to default on its obligations. The recession hit other areas of their business empire also. Among the most prominent casualties were Lupo's chain of grocery stores. Fewer and fewer Italians could afford Lupo's high prices. The Wolf had also acquired the habit of draining his businesses of capital in order to fund his extravagant lifestyle. Meanwhile, Joe Petrosino was promoted to lieutenant in 1907 among much fanfare. One paper wrote how he was able to identify 3,000 Italian criminals by sight. However, Joe Petrosino was only one man, and the bodies kept piling up. In February of 1908, the body of Salvatore Marciani was discovered with his throat slashed and his body mutilated. Though there was no evidence, the streets knew the Morello mob was involved, and they whispered it in Petrosino's ears wherever he went. Economic conditions continued to worsen in the fall of 1908. Even Lupo's Mott Street store was teetering on the brink of insolvency. At the time, Lupo's property portfolio was worth about $110,000. The Wolf, however, had mortgages totaling $72,000 and had just remortgaged for a further $13,000. By the time the auditors arrived at Mott Street to scavenge the remains, the entire chain of stores had assets including stock of only $1,500 and debts in excess of $100,000. The need for more funds became pressing. When Ignazio Lupo vanished from New York, Hotly pursued by his creditors, he took one last opportunity to steal from them by ordering $50,000 worth of goods on credit and having it shipped to a dockside warehouse in Hoboken, New Jersey, from where they were supposed to have been sent to Sicily for sale by old associates in Palermo. However, due to the dogged determination of Petrosino, the squad was able to follow the paper trail, track down the missing consignments, and have them impounded. With another source of cash cut off, Lupo became reckless. In an effort to raise emergency funds, the Wolf had stepped up his extortion activities. One evening, after several people had already missed payments, an old street cart vendor arrived at Lupo's headquarters. The man had borrowed $50 from Lupo in an attempt to keep his meager livelihood as a street merchant. Now he could not pay the $2 a week in interest. For Lupo, this was normally a small sum, but things were tight and he had already had several people miss payments today. The straw that broke the camel's back was a newspaper the man carried with Lupo's nemesis, Joe Petrosino, on the front. Without warning, Lupo reached across and grabbed the old man by his lapel, pulling him over the counter. The men in his crew stood by in shock as Lupo began to stomp the man into the hardwood floor. He then dragged the man back from behind the counter, kicking him as he went. Lupo then plucked the man's walking stick from the floor and began beating him with it. Finally, after several blows, the stick broke over the man's head. This finally seemed to temper some of Lupo's vigor. He then turned to his crew and yelled, "Get this pile of trash out of my store." His men obeyed, dragging the man out to a back alleyway and leaving him there. This old man was eventually taken to the hospital, where he survived, but with severe handicaps. When Petrosino heard about the man found nearly dead behind Lupo's saloon, his eyes flashed with rage. The police knew that Lupo was once again back to his old tricks and had begun extorting local businessmen. But beating an old man almost to death? That was a step too far for Petrosino. Without thinking, he stormed out of the precinct with a mask of fury plainly stamped on his face. He knew the man who was now fighting for his life at the hospital. He was the man who sold vegetables down on the corner. A kindly old man just trying to survive in a heartless city. This thought made him even angrier. He walked over to Lupo's saloon, unsure of what he was going to do. Talk maybe? Maybe not. Either way, the Wolf was about to receive a highly public visit from Joe Petrosino. As the angry detective approached, he saw Lupo and Ciro Terranova sitting and talking while drinking coffee. As he began crossing the street and walking quickly toward the saloon, the two men turned to regard him. On Ciro Terranova's face, he saw shocked surprise. That was good. Lupo, however, sneered and began to swagger over to meet the detective. Lupo's confident swagger and look of untouchability helped Petrosino decide what to do next. The two men met in the street with their faces only inches apart. Lupo opened his mouth to speak, but his voice was cut off with a fist. Without warning, Petrosino had struck Lupo hard in the chin. Every bit of his 300-pound bulk was behind the punch, knocking Lupo hard to the pavement. Rapidly changing from Italian to Brooklynese, Petrosino yelled at the top of his lungs.
"You think you're a tough guy? You ain't no tough guy. You got nothing. Ugats. Nothing."
He kicked the now unconscious man in the gut while continuing this tirade. After a few kicks, both his rage and his energy began to subside. He walked away while Terranova bent down to try to revive his comrade. The fight ended with dozens of witnesses and Lupo unconscious on the ground. It was a story destined to grow wings, and in no time, it was the talk of Little Italy. The Wolf's already dangerous temper was not improved by the exaggerated versions of events that soon began to circulate. The worst of these embellishments had the detective dumping Lupo's beaten and unconscious body in a barrel and leaving him in the middle of the street. For his part, Lupo's hatred for Petrosino grew exponentially. When Lupo caught wind of the newly embellished story, he could no longer control himself.
"I will see this disgrazia dead in the ground,"
Lupo told Morello one evening after too many drinks. Morello said nothing to this, opting instead to whisper in Lupo's ear.
"Killing the most well-known policeman in the city will mean our deaths, yours and mine, Ignacio. But you will die first. Do you understand?"
Morello finished. Lupo said nothing. It seems he did understand. The whole of New York may fear Ignazio Lupo, but the only man Lupo feared was Giuseppe Morello. Only the strict edict from his boss prevented Lupo from making an attempt on Petrosino's life. This altercation continued to grow the legend of Lieutenant Joe Petrosino, and if he had any fear at all of the Mafia or Giuseppe Morello, he did not show it. Petrosino and his men dutifully kept the pressure on. Antonio Milone was the president of the Ignots Florio co-op. He did not associate with street thugs or people of low character, and was generally thought of as a good and honest man. But Milone had secrets. Unknown to all but a few, he had been made into the secret society and handled all of Giuseppe Morello's ill-gotten gains. Milone was also an engraver and secretly produced the plates which were used to make the counterfeit bills. The technique that Milone used to etch each of the plates was called photo engraving, and these were two of the best that he'd ever made. A week later, Morello's soldier Salvatore Sina came and picked up the plates. Meanwhile, a young printer's apprentice named Antonio Comito met with Morello's soldier Antonio Scala about a job as a printer in Philadelphia. Needing money to support his wife and himself, Comito agreed immediately. However, Scala hadn't given Comito the whole story. Instead of going to Philadelphia, Comito was taken to a farm near Pittston. Once there, he was given two choices: print counterfeit currency for Scala or die in the woods. Comito chose life. The date was November 15, 1908. Meanwhile, around the time Comito was making his decision, the Italian squad raided a small Brooklyn apartment which was being used as a makeshift bomb factory. Over the next 3 months, the squad was called in to investigate 8 bombings, several dozen Black Hand extortion threats, and over a dozen gang-related murders. Despite winning various battles, it felt like they were losing the war. The murder rate was up, bombings were up, property crime was on the rise, and so were the number of threats made by the Black Hand. The gangs of New York were increasingly becoming more organized and efficient, and the Morello crime family stood at the forefront. This increase in sophistication continued to make policing more and more difficult, and despite the recent downturn in construction, the family's other rackets seemed to be humming along nicely. Just lately, Joe Petrosino had been realizing he now had a public profile. At one time, he could put on a disguise and mingle with criminals in Little Italy and East Harlem. Now, he was recognized halfway down the street. Petrosino's name means parsley in Italian, so whenever he heard a vendor yell, "Fresh parsley here, parsley for sale," he knew he had been spotted. His new notoriety also made him a target for up-and-coming mafiosos. Still, criminals of all stripes feared and respected him. His beating of Lupo had given him an aura of invincibility in the neighborhood. He also knew that to maintain this aura was akin to his continued breathing, so he did not discourage it. Still, the problem of convicting these criminals remained. Petrosino became convinced the only way to win this war was to see every Sicilian criminal return to the old country. Meanwhile, back on the farm, Comito's troubles had only begun. A second printer had arrived days ago. This man was far more talented than he himself. This new arrival, Giuseppe Calicchio, was a sad-looking gentleman from the southern region of Puglia, who was in his early 50s and had once been a manufacturer of counterfeits in Italy. Calicchio, who had worked before with the Morellos, was respectfully referred to as Don Giuseppe by Scala and the other mafiosos. Comito feared correctly that his value was diminishing. With all that was going on in the streets of New York, Petrosino decided to complicate his life further by getting married and having a daughter. Being a bachelor his whole life, the change to a family man was a drastic one. Further upheaval was caused when crime crusader Theodore Bingham replaced McAdoo as police commissioner. Bingham had an eye on reform, and his target was the Black Hand in New York City. Shortly after taking command, Bingham called for a meeting with Petrosino. The two met at Bingham's office just 2 days later. When Petrosino entered, Theodore Bingham rose and shook his hand vigorously. Then with a commanding presence, he boomed, "Good morning, Lieutenant." Petrosino was impressed. Long before he was Police Commissioner Bingham, he was General Bingham serving with the Army Corps of Engineers. Known as a tough man with a terse demeanor and a dry wit, Bingham became controversial with his extreme views on crime in New York City. He was even quoted in one newspaper as saying 85% of New York's criminals were of exotic origin. He came to New York after a long posting in Washington and had a reputation for getting things done. After they shook, Bingham motioned Petrosino to a chair, and the two sat. Coming in, Petrosino hadn't known what to expect. Still, Bingham's next statement truly surprised him. "I want you to go to Italy. In order to combat these Black Hand gangs, we must improve our intelligence. We have 2,000 known criminals with no background information. We need to know what the police in Italy know. We also need to open up lines of communication and cooperation between law enforcement in the United States and law enforcement in Italy. Would you accept this mission, Lieutenant Petrosino?" Bingham asked vehemently. "With all due respect, Commissioner Bingham, I've just been married and have a young daughter. Couldn't there be someone better suited for this mission?" Petrosino responded. "No, sir, there is no one better suited than you," Bingham replied, keeping the pressure on. This back and forth continued for another 10 minutes until Petrosino finally gave in. In his heart, Petrosino knew he was not a good fit for this mission. He was an investigator, not a diplomat. However, he could understand Bingham's reasoning. Though not cursed with a big ego, even he could see how he was becoming the face of the fight against the Black Hand. This newfound notoriety would make his mission even more dangerous. And it was no longer just his own life that he had to consider. All the many years of being married to the job had given way to a new life with his wife and young daughter. If he took this trip, there was a real chance he may never return. Where would that leave them? In the end, he felt it was his duty to see these Italian criminals in prison. If not him, then who, he reasoned. Along with his wife and daughter, his oldest friend, Sergeant Vakris, went down to the pier to see him off. After hugging and kissing his family goodbye, he shared a few words with his old friend. "Oh, Jesus, can you believe this, buddy? 40 years and I'm going back," Petrosino cackled. Vakris, who had known Petrosino for years and could tell despite his outward joviality, the man was not happy about going back to Italy. "Hey, be careful, boss," Vakris said with a straight face. "Words can travel like the wind over there, so be vigilant, huh?" He finished, giving his old friend a hug. The old detective then boarded the boat and waved at his family. An hour later, the boat left the harbor and Detective Petrosino was on it. The boat which Petrosino now boarded was named Duca de Genova and afforded extravagant luxury for its first-class patrons. Due to the rather large budget afforded him by Bingham, this was how he chose to travel. His cover was that of a Jewish businessman named Simone Velletri. Once aboard, Petrosino would spend the early days of the voyage hidden away in his room. When he finally emerged, he told those that asked that he was returning home for care with a digestive malady. After doing his best to keep his identity under wraps, Petrosino finally arrived in Italy. Once there, he immediately caught the train to Rome. He arrived in Rome that evening and checked into the Hotel Inghilterra under a different alias. The next morning, Petrosino woke early and headed over to the American Embassy for a scheduled appointment with American Ambassador to Italy, Lloyd Griscom. After passing through security, he was met by Griscom. "Welcome to Rome, Lieutenant Petrosino," the gregarious man said with a smile.
"Please don't take offense if I don't stay long," Petrosino replied with a smile of his own.
"No, I don't expect you would," Griscom said with a chuckle. He then paused for a moment before continuing. "Take care where you travel, Lieutenant. There are many dangerous men with your name on their lips, and I don't want to see you splashed across anything other than the newspapers," the ambassador said grimly. Griscom then handed Petrosino what he had come for: letters of introduction to the Interior Ministry of Italy as well as the local police.
"Thank you, Ambassador. This will be of great—"
"Just be careful, Lieutenant. These are serious men," Griscom interjected. "If the wrong people find out you're here, they'll kill you." Meanwhile, across the ocean in East Harlem, Morello sat having an espresso when a young boy came running into his saloon. He recognized the kid as the son of a mob soldier that was used to relay messages between them.
"Don Morello, Don Lupo asked that you read this,"
the boy stammered, clearly out of breath. Morello looked at the newspaper. Down in the corner, a small article was circled. The article was written in Italian. Giuseppe Morello began to read. Once in Rome, Petrosino felt anonymous and much safer than he did on the boat. Things may have been different if he'd have known that the local Araldo Italiano newspaper was reporting on Petrosino's ongoing war with the Black Hand in New York, and that he had made plans to leave for Italy. While the article was hardly front-page news, it was noticed, and by the time he reached Rome, news of Petrosino's trip was in several Italian newspapers. The cat was out of the proverbial bag. Not only had Petrosino been identified by an Italian reporter in Rome, but he had thought he had recognized familiar men appearing over and over, making the wily old detective paranoid. When he saw the same man a fourth time, Petrosino flipped the detective switch and followed the man at a distance. After a time, he was able to track his would-be spy to a local post office. He later learned the man had sent several cables to Sicily. Knowing that his next stop was in Palermo, but now in fear that his secret was truly out, Petrosino did not travel there on any of the passenger ships that shuttled up and down the Italian coast. Instead, he took a train to Naples, where he paid the captain of a mailboat to take him on board. Once on the boat, Petrosino tried to relax and sleep as the little steamer sailed south overnight. Petrosino awoke at dawn just moments before the boat touched land. There was an ominous feeling of doom as the detective stepped ashore in a quiet corner of Palermo's docks. The date was February 28, 1909. After taking what he thought were sufficient precautions, he had convinced himself that his arrival had gone unnoticed. This feeling that he'd left his pursuers behind in Rome caused Petrosino to start making mistakes. He opened a bank account in his own name and had begun to get comfortable with local waiters and shopkeepers, breaking character from time to time. During this time, he also worked extremely hard, spending late nights in police stations and courthouses, copying down police and court records until the late hours of the evening. Petrosino's plan was to finish the mission and get home quickly, and for a while, it looked like that was what was going to happen. That was until the day of March 12th. Petrosino left his rented flat and walked to Palermo's Piazza Marina around 6 p.m. Arriving at his favorite restaurant, Petrosino took up his usual table against the wall, far from the entrance. He ordered his pasta and waited for his dinner companions. A man he'd been working with in the Palermo courthouse named Paolo was to introduce him to an important informant in the employ of one of the rising powers in Sicily. That rising power went by the name of Vito Cassioferro. Cassioferro, along with Morello, had been on the top of Petrosino's list for years. His food arrived, and he began to eat. Halfway through his appetizer, Paolo arrived as well. He approached the table quickly and leaned into Petrosino's ear, whispering, "Our friend says this place is too public. He has a spot over by the stables. You must follow me," he finished. "Tell your friend I don't like to change plans. He can meet me here or not at all." Not deterred, Paolo tried again, speaking softly.
Things aren't safe, my friend. This is the best for everyone. Please, do as I ask.
Petrosino huffed and nodded as the rest of his food arrived. Rather than digging in, Petrosino paid the bill and followed Paolo out the door. As the two men walked, Petrosino began to feel some intuition creeping up his spine. Glancing over at Paolo, the old detective noticed the man was soaked with sweat, despite the cool night air. Alarm bells began immediately going off in his head. Unfortunately, it was too little too late. As they rounded the corner, Paolo veered off while two other men stepped from the shadows. A barrage of bullets were fired, striking Petrosino 3 times. Then one last shot inflicted the 4th and final wound directly into Petrosino's throat. Seconds after the shots rang out, the lights illuminating the square darkened as someone had cut the flow of gas to the lamps, making effective pursuit impossible. When the police searched Petrosino's wallet, they found a postcard with a message reading, "A kiss for you, my little girl, who has spent 3 months far from her daddy." Meanwhile, from a farmhouse on the outskirts of Palermo, Vito Cassioferro sent a coded message from Sicily to Giuseppe Morello back in Italian Harlem. The message was a simple one. "Now this stone has been cast from our path," was all it said. Morello received the message shortly after. Despite the feeling of relief, there was also a slight feeling of sadness as Morello fell asleep that night. Petrosino was a worthy adversary, and now he was gone.